All right. Good morning, guys. I'm Mike Yost with the Philadelphia District Army Corps. I work out of the Dover field office, and I've been there for about 5 years, and I've had the pleasure of working with some of the folks that are attending and panelists that have completed some of the projects that we've seen over the past few presentations. So let's just jump right into what is regulated. I should say this is intended to be kind of a general idea of the things that we need and to review a project, and we're not going to go into crazy detail as to some of the language related to the nationwide permits, but so what is regulated? Section 10 authorizes the Army Corps to permit structures or work in navigable waters. So the key there is navigable waters. And Section 404 authorizes the Army Corps to permit the discharge of dredged and or fill material into waters of the U.S. So we have navigable waters in Section 10, and we have waters of the U.S. in Section 404. So those are a couple keys to keep in mind. And typically living shorelines will involve both authorities. Excuse me. So do I need a permit? Well, this diagram demonstrates jurisdiction as it relates to habitat types. So if you're working in these areas, Section 404, Section 10, or the wetlands beyond the Section 404 line, then yeah, you're gonna need a permit. And the important lines here are the high tide line and the mean high water line. Mean high water line, that is your extent of the Section 10 authority, then goes to the high tide line, which is your landward extent of Section 404, and including wetlands that are beyond that if there are. For our accounting purposes, we have to identify the habitat types that are impacted and whether or not there is a loss of waters of the U.S. So distinguishing these lines, the high tide line, the mean high water line, makes it easier for the regulator to account for the impacts properly and avoid coming back and asking for additional information. So just make sure if you're designing your project, you're getting these lines on the plan and they're accurate. So living shorelines can be potentially authorized using the nationwide permits. The nationwide permits are a general permit for certain specified activities on a nationwide basis. They are determined, again, on a nationwide basis to have minimal individual cumulative adverse environmental impacts. And you must satisfy all terms and general conditions and regional general conditions of the nationwide permit for valid authorization to occur. And they expire 5 years from the date of issuance. So currently, the 2017 nationwide permits will expire in March of 2022. Now, if your activity is commenced prior to the expiration of the permit, the work can be finished as long as it's finished within a year of that expiration. And if the permit does expire and the work has yet to be accomplished or even started, or if you're in the middle of doing it and you're not going to finish in a year, then you do have the ability to reauthorize under the new nationwide permits as long as the project still meets the terms and conditions of the reauthorized nationwide permit. So there are 3 potential options to authorize a living shoreline. They all have specific terms, general conditions, and regional conditions that you need to ensure that you read carefully to see if the proposed project fits the criteria. If the project doesn't quite fit in a single nationwide permit and portions of the project have independent utility, independent utility means, in other words, some of the project can be completed independently of other portions of the project, then multiple nationwide permits can potentially be used. It's all site-specific, but you do have that ability to break up the project into a couple nationwide permits if they have independent utility. So how do you apply? We have the forms on our website. There's links on there to the nationwide permit terms and conditions and the Delaware regional conditions. If you go to the Philadelphia District website, there is a couple links on the right-hand side of the homepage, and one is regulatory. So within the regulatory link, we have a lot of information there, and a lot of the information that I'm sharing with you today is all on there. So what are the application requirements? The most basic form of an application needs to have at least a delineation plan showing the federal jurisdiction, like in that diagram that I showed earlier. A plan that shows the proposed impacts, including a quantification of the area of impacts, the basic application form, and I'll share that a little later. There's 2 different forms that you can use. The ENG 4345 form is the one that we've been using forever, and they just recently, I believe it was late last year or early this year, came out with a new ENG 6082 form, which is meant to update that old form. It just has a little more detail, and we'll get into that. And then the agency correspondence, that's outlined in the regional conditions for Delaware's nationwide permits. So the agencies, the first and easiest agency to get out of the way is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They use the IPAC system to start your Endangered Species Act review. And it's a pretty simple system. You hit the Get Started button, as you see on the screen there. Or if you have an account, if you create an account with them, you just log in. You draw a polygon around your action area. And so your action area should be your essentially your limit of disturbance. You know, any staging area that you may have, that should all be included in your action area. And then when you go through that, you can request an official species list, and it will provide you with a document of either no resources present, and you can continue on with your project, or there may be species within your action area, and it'll generate that list for you, and you should include that with your application so that we can, as the Corps, make a determination as to the effect on those resources. Now, the National Marine Fisheries Service does have a website for Endangered Species Act review. I did not, I forgot to put it in the presentation, but generally you don't have as many issues with National Marine Fisheries Service, especially if you're working in the inland bays area. Their main concerns in Delaware are related to sturgeon, Atlantic sturgeon, short-nosed sturgeon. We haven't had any recordings of sturgeon in the inland bays to my knowledge. That's probably why I failed to include that in the applicant or in the presentation. But they do have a website for review, and you can that's in our regional conditions as well. You can find it there if you want to check that out. Let's see. The next agency would be the other side of the National Marine Fisheries Service. This is the Habitat Conservation Division, and they are reviewing projects for essential fish habitat impacts. And with nationwide permits that you would use for a living shoreline, either 27 or 13 or 54, well, not 13, 27 or 54, nationwide permit 27 or 54, they need to see a complete pre-construction notification. So whatever you plan on sending to us in your application, all that information needs to be forwarded on to the National Marine Fisheries Service Habitat Conservation Division. And email is preferred method of correspondence right now. That's typically how it's been. They also have a general National Marine Fisheries Service email that I can get you if you would like that. I believe that is also, I think we may have that in our regional conditions as well. The next agency is the DNREC Species Conservation and Research Program. Again, you got to provide them with the same information you would provide the Corps, and they will provide information or comment on your project as to whether there are important resource concerns in the project vicinity that need to be considered, and they'll also indicate as to whether or not the project is within a state natural heritage site, which is considered a critical resource water in Delaware, and that has its own implications, but not really necessary to discuss in this presentation. Just know that it does have its own implications and may require some additional information. The other things mentioned here would be the water quality certification and the coastal zone management consistency. Both of those have been issued for all of these permits that we're discussing today, 13, 27, and 54. But I think nationwide 13, they are denied in critical resource waters only. So if you're in a critical resource water, if you're doing a project in a critical resource water, then you may have to get individual water quality certification and CZM consistency. But in general, they are issued. The next state agency is the State Historic Preservation Office, or Historic and Cultural Affairs. Again, provide them with the same information that you would provide the Corps. They're going to provide you with comment and tell you whether or not there are historic or cultural resources in the project vicinity, and they will make their own effect determination, and you can forward that on to us with your application. so that we can review their comments. All right, and so now we got the form. The form provides general information and details important for our record keeping and review. This is the new form. The old form looks pretty similar to this, but like I said before, the new form has a little more information requirements. Provides a little more added detail to help aid in the receipt of a complete application, and we'll look at some of these blocks in a minute. But if you're familiar with the old form, you can see here that there are quite a few additional blocks that to be covered. And some of the information on these blocks is generated by your agency correspondence. So it's not necessary to fill them all out if you have that correspondence that has that information. No need to waste your time on going through that. Let's see, and then I do want to talk about some of the blocks that have been issued in the past as far as the information that's provided. So block 19, description of the proposed activity. Sometimes some of the information is missed here, but you want to describe the activity, including the direct and indirect adverse environmental effects, size and types of materials, methods of installation, temporary fills in our structures, approximate begin and end dates of construction, vessels that are necessary, if applicable. All of this information is important if we have to do some sort of Endangered Species Act consultation to be able to determine the impacts. And the big thing here is describing the direct and indirect adverse effects, and those are things like turbidity, noise, habitat loss replacement, and will the impacts be temporary or permanent? The next block is the description of proposed mitigation measures. Now, this one is for the most part never completed correctly, and you want to describe any of the proposed mitigation measures intended to reduce the adverse environmental effects caused by the activity. So in other words, how does the project have been designed to avoid and minimize the adverse environmental impacts? Things like turbidity curtains, cofferdams, working during low flow or low tide conditions, and working during low biological productivity. So in the winter months, when things slow down, those are all important things to consider in your mitigation measures, your avoidance measures, to make sure that your project does have minimal adverse environmental impacts. And 21, this is another block that is missed a lot. Need to have a purpose and need. Now, the need is describing some part of an area within the project limits is not functioning as it should, and your purpose is this is how we'd like to have the area function once the project is completed. So you need to establish a need because the need drives the purpose. And I think that was covered pretty well yesterday, and going over the project goals. And but this is an important part, extremely important part, to ensure that there is a need for your project. The other block that isn't really filled out quite correctly, but that's probably more of an error on the form's part, is block 22, the quantity of the aquatic resources affected. So on the plan, the aquatic resources need to be identified by some sort of naming convention. So here we've got, the aquatic resource ID has been identified and giving the coordinate classification. You can see in this aquatic resource ID here. And the impacts and area of impacts need to be identified within the aquatic resources. So make sure that wherever your impacts are, they're identified within that aquatic resource ID. And then, this table is a good example of what we have seen in the past and kind of how we break it down when we're accounting for impacts and potential losses. And that pretty much wraps it up for me. The other thing on this, I would say, if you have any questions, give me a call. Don't call our office phone, ever. Our phones do not work. So call me on my mobile phone. It's highlighted in red, or you can email us. John is the senior biologist in our office. He can be somewhat difficult to get a hold of sometimes, but his email is always working. It should be. But give me a call on my cell phone.
Yep, so if you have any questions, feel free to enter them in the chat. I have one for you, Mike. So assuming that you get all the application materials you need, how long does it take from when you get it to it being approved on average?
Yeah, so that depends on if there are agency comments that need to be addressed. But if there are no agency comments that need to be addressed, then typically I can get a permit out within like a 2 to 4 week time frame. Okay.
What's the longest time frame you've ever had for a permit, just out of curiosity?
Let's see. A couple years. But that's an individual permit, not a nationwide permit. Nationwide permits generally, I think nationwide permits, the longest may have been like 6 to 8 months, but that was due to consultations and endangered species issues or historic agricultural affairs issues. So working that stuff out, but. Yeah, nationwide permits are meant to be expedited. They've already been determined on a nationwide basis that they have minimal impacts and therefore are supposed to be a faster turnaround time to get a permit than an individual permit.
Okay, thank you. And we do have one question in here, which is asking about floating wetlands. So have floating wetlands been permitted as part of a living shoreline?
That's a good question. They have not, and we have had that proposed. However, floating wetlands have they have a place. And typically that place is not in an area that is exposed to a lot of fetch and wave energy. So in places like dead-end lagoons, I don't see floating wetland being an issue. But if it's along a shoreline, eventually they're going to be a maintenance issue. And it's going to be more of a problem and more of a navigation hazard than what aquatic resource uplift you will get out of it. Floating shorelines have their place, or floating wetlands have their place, but on a shoreline with a lot of fetch and boat energy and wave energy, the anchorage of those floating wetlands is going to be an issue. So yeah, it hasn't been approved to my knowledge in Delaware as of yet.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mike. If you guys have any questions, feel free to keep them coming. I'm going to go ahead and make Julie the presenter. All right, Julie, you should be able to share your screen.
Thanks, Brittany. So I just wanted to add on to the floating wetlands portion is that we have issued some in lagoons. That's the only area that I've seen them issued, but typically with them being issued in the lagoon, we've used the lagoon SAA when issuing them. So I don't think it came across your desk, Mike, for any kind of review for that. But the problem that we did end up in the South Bethany lagoons where they were installed, SAV started to grow, and then that became a problem because some of the homeowners started to cut it down because it just started tying up into their propellers and became a navigational issue for them. So it actually, even though it did improve water quality and allowed SAVs to grow, it did become a problem in that particular area, and then it became an enforcement issue because we have separate protections for SAV, although you can cut it down. But it did end up becoming a problem in the one location that we did allow it in Delaware.
SAV is submerged aquatic vegetation, seagrasses.
Yes. So I just want to go ahead and so I just want to go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Julie Molina, and I am presenting today on behalf of the DNREC Wetlands and Subaqueous Land section. We are the section within DNREC that will process your permit for any activity within our jurisdiction. So essentially, this presentation is going to have two parts. The first part is going to talk about our jurisdiction, and then I'm going to go into how to appropriately apply for your permit authorization. So the first regulation that I'm going to speak to is the regulations governing the use of subaqueous lands. This regulation has given us the ability to have jurisdictional authority over public or private subaqueous lands. And if you want to think of it in a quick way, basically we have jurisdiction channelward of the mean high water line in tidal water bodies and within the ordinary high water mark within non-tidal water bodies. So I do have some images here just to better explain our jurisdiction. So in non-tidal waters, this graphic shows that we have jurisdiction, of course, within the ordinary high water mark. That would be within non-tidal waters such as lakes, ponds, bays, inlets, streams that either are intermittent or perennial. We do not have jurisdiction of ephemeral features. And just to note that in Delaware, especially within Sussex County, there's a lot of historically natural features that were either relocated or channelized at some point in time, and we would also have jurisdiction of those features. And this image here shows our jurisdiction over tidal waters, and as it explains here, we have jurisdiction over activities and placement of structure in, on, over, or under your tidal streams, lakes, ponds, or bays, and inlets. And that comes straight from the regulation as far as it's stating in, on, over, under. So expect that you will need a permit for your activity. So within this, and you know, different types of examples that I can think of where you would need your permit is different types of activities would be for a pier, a dock, it could be a utility line, so that's, you know, directional drill or open trench. And then, of course, you know, your shoreline stabilization project, which is what we're talking about here today. As you can see here are, you know, I think you can see my mouse here. So marked right here is the mean high water line. This is where our authority and jurisdiction starts in tidal waters. And then anything channelward of the mean low water line on public subaqueous lands requires a subaqueous lands lease. So we have different types of permits depending on the activity and where our jurisdiction is. And this distinction is very important, where the mean low water line is, and if it's public subaqueous lands. And this is something that as someone who's perhaps doing a job for a landowner, you want to take a look at their deed and see exactly where it says within the text of the deed where they own. So typically Delaware is a mean low water state, meaning that most deeds say they own, for waterfront properties, say that they own to the mean low water line. But sometimes you'll get that scenario where they own to the mean high, so in that case, you know, a lease would be triggered at the mean high water line. It's an atypical situation, but it's just something to be aware of. And you could always, if you're not sure of what type of permit you need, you know, feel free to contact us. You know, that's what we're there for. And the other difference I also want to point out with the lease is that they are actually renewed every 10 years versus some of our other permits where they don't need to be renewed. They're just a one-time authorization. And then this image also shows our 3-mile jurisdictional limit line in coastline areas, but that differs slightly in the Delaware River and Bay. So the second regulation I'm going to talk about today are the wetlands regulations. So on the right-hand side of the screen, that is actually the state regulatory definition for wetlands. So it's very specifically stated within the regulations, and something to keep in mind is that our jurisdiction, state-regulated jurisdiction for wetlands can at many times be very different from your federally regulated wetland line. So it's something that you need to do your background on both areas. So just to get into a deeper explanation of what our jurisdiction looks like. As far as state-regulated wetlands, we have jurisdiction over non-tidal wetlands of 400 or more contiguous acres. There is only one area, I believe, in the state of Delaware that for non-tidal wetlands that actually would be included in that. So most of our jurisdiction is actually tidal wetlands. So that's what you'll often hear, is that we only have jurisdiction of tidal wetlands. But we do have one area where we do have non-tidal wetland jurisdiction. But the key element that I teased out of the regulatory definition is that it would have to be tidal wetlands whose surface is at or below an elevation of 2 feet above local mean high water, and is capable of growing wetland plants as listed in the wetland regulations. So, you know, just to clarify that below, above text, you know, this image nicely shows that this is your local mean high water at an elevation of 1, and then you can see wetland vegetation persisting 2 feet above at the 3-foot mark. So that's where our wetland jurisdiction would be at. And to clarify even further, we do have locations of where these state-regulated lines are. And I have included the link within this web page here, within this slide here. So if you just click on that link, it would take you to the image that you see on the left. You can type in the address, and then all of those little green squares are actually maps that were adopted within the regulations in 1988. So all of those maps, you know, where they include basically, it's a black and white map, which isn't the best to reference when you're trying to look at if a project is clear. Well, it is good if you're looking to see if it's clearly within or without the state's jurisdiction, but if it's borderline, I would say definitely contact our office in order to request a jurisdictional determination. That's, you know, a service that we offer for free, that we will go out there and we will flag, as well as we would capture and give you the GPS points of the location of where our line is. And also, just to add to that point, is that the state is the only, or actually the Wetlands and Contiguous Land section has exclusive authority to determine jurisdiction. So even if you routinely go out there and conduct wetland delineations, you know, based on the core manual, you still need to come to us to get that jurisdictional determination. And then also, just to add, we do have a map change process where if you're looking, if you download one of those black and white maps and you have concerns that it's saying that there's wetlands where in the field you're not finding the elevation or the wetland vegetation in those areas, then you can request a map change. That is something that you would have to apply for, and you'd have to provide data to back that up as far as submitting a survey that also has what vegetation is growing in that area. But I do also want to just point out that those maps that are included to download, they have not been georeferenced. That's something that we do internally when we are conducting a jurisdictional determination. So definitely come to our office to make sure that you know exactly where the wetlands are on the property that you are designing. So just to move on, so the second part of this presentation will be about obtaining the authorization for the Living Shoreline project. Other presenters mentioned our statewide activity approval, which is the SAA for shoreline stabilization projects. It is an expedited permitting process that we have offered to promote living shorelines. It is not intended rather, for standalone shoreline stabilization measures. So if you're thinking of a riprap revetment or beach nourishment or anything along those lines, a bulkhead, this is not the appropriate permit. It would have to include shoreline stabilization as well as providing a net ecological uplift. So the benefit of this expedited process is you would not have to put your project on a 20-day public notice period, and you would not have the $85 public notice fee. And then just to point out, this is similar to the nationwide permit. However, it has not already been issued. It's similar in that it's expedited, but it has not already been issued. So you still will receive a written SAA approval document specific to your project site. And there's other differences that I'm going to get into later on in this slideshow. And then I also did want to point out that that these projects, even though they don't go on public notice, we still do send them to DNREC Fish and Wildlife in order to get any time of year restrictions that would be implemented within the permit approval. So just moving on, within the SAA, we do have a a few living shoreline classifications. We're actually currently in the process of updating this document. We update it every 5 years, and previously it did have 3 categories, but now we're still going through the process, but we're going to minimize it to 2 categories, acknowledging that, you know, there is that gradient between conventional living shoreline where you're using just those naturally based treatments, you know, and thinking of core logs, shell bags, sand fill material, and then it moves on to a gradient of more of the structural elements, and that's when we would consider it a hybrid living shoreline. So it would be a combination of both, but just more of a structural element when you're thinking about a hybrid living shoreline. So this would include different techniques like a marsh toe fill or oyster castles, any type of wave attenuation device. So we have listed here the exclusions to the SAA. So if your project is within the scope of any of these parameters listed here, then it would not be permittable under the SAA. So I'm just going to call out a few that usually would end up throwing the project out of being able to use the SAA. The first one lists if a state wetlands permit is required. So if you go to your site and you see wetlands there, and then you come to us and get a jurisdictional determination done and find out that you're going to need a wetlands permit in order to conduct your activity, then you wouldn't be able to use the SAA. You can go through a separate permitting process, you just wouldn't be able to use this one. And then another specific item would be that you do have to have some sort of you have to demonstrate that shoreline erosion is occurring at the site, and that is the purpose of your project. If it's a enhancement project or something along those lines, then it would be better suited to our normal permitting process. And then the other limitation that we do have here is that this SAA is limited to the mean low water line. So basically it's limited to that intertidal zone for the activity. So you may now be thinking, well, how can I get my permit then? So 2 of our other permitting processes is a civic wastelands permit and a civic wastelands lease. I did talk about this a little bit earlier. So basically, if you have a civic waste, if you're going to, so the alternative permitting processes do require a public notice process, which is the 20-day advertisement that I mentioned before, as well as the fee. So the civic wastelands permit is triggered for activities channelward of the mean high water line or within the ordinary high water mark in private civic wastelands. And then the civic wastelands lease would be triggered for activities channelward of the mean low water line in public civic wastelands. So if you look back to what I was, that other image before that explains, you know, our jurisdiction. And again, I would highly recommend reading the language of the deed to see where the property owner actually owns too. And part of our civic wastelands lease process is not only the fact that you have to renew it on a 10-year term, is that if you're using any kind of fill material channelward of that mean low water line, then you will be charged per square foot a rate. So if it's rock, it would be $1 a square foot, and it goes so on from there. And that is really meant as a deterrent, because we don't essentially want civic wastelands filled. And again, this would require substantial justification and need if you're having to extend your shoreline stabilization project past the mean low water line. So I did also want to emphasize that all of the permit processes that I've been mentioning are for the construction of the project, so it doesn't inherently include the maintenance. So typically for your, for your SAA project, you have a 1-year construction window, and then we do allow 3 years for maintenance. And the difference with the subaqueous lands permit and lease is you have a 3-year construction window, and then you can also have a maintenance period after that to maintain your project, because you may find that you need to replant if your plantings didn't succeed, and then you may need to add a little bit more fill to bring up that elevation. But I will stress that so in the more recent permit approvals that we've been issuing, we have been providing that caveat that you can conduct maintenance activities, but you need to contact our section before you conduct those activities, because it may require a separate approval depending on the scope of it. So that's something to just keep in mind when you're working on your project, when you're doing your monitoring of your project. You may need to, if you're finding an issue that needs to be rectified, then you will need to contact our office in order to make sure a permit approval isn't needed. And just speaking to monitoring, it's not typical that we require monitoring, but if it's a pilot project, if it's something new, that is something that we have required in the past as a permit condition, and something that we have included are details such as you would have to submit a monitoring report once a year for a 3-year period. So just to go over your complete application checklist, there's the basic application form. You have your appropriate appendices, a copy of the deed and survey. This is something different than the federal jurisdiction. We do require the applicant to be the waterfront property owner, and if they're not, they have to have some sort of letter stating that the work can be completed. So that's an important distinction, and that's, going back to, what I was referencing before with looking at the deed. You want to make sure you're keeping your project within the scope of the survey. And then just to add, you definitely need your plan view and your cross-section view of your project, and you need to really clearly indicate those mean high water line and mean low water line areas. So, as Mike said, it doesn't come into question later on in the project. And then you want a vicinity map to show the area, and then as well as, and I listed here your underwater landowner signature if it's appropriate. And then for your SAA, the application fee is $225, and then as I said before, if you're going to go through the subaqueous lands permit and the subaqueous lands lease, it would have to have the additional $85 public notice fee. So I have there listed the address where you would mail your complete application packet, but we've also now allowed for the ability to apply online. So the link is included right there. So I also did want to speak to our cost share process. We do have money available pending availability. So it's something that we have to apply for, and we do have money right now. Actually, if you have a project in Delaware and you're wondering if you can apply for cost share. So the cost share is available on all jurisdictional waters, and it can be paid up to 50% of the actual cost of the project, not to exceed $5,000. So if your project costs $10,000, then we would supply $5,000 of it. But just thinking when you're designing your project, the cost share money would only go toward the materials and the labor for the project. And then The landowner must agree to maintain this living shoreline for 3 years, and they're responsible to ensure 85% has been vegetated of the area. So this is the eligible criteria listed below. Only one criteria has to be met. I'm not going to read them through because I know you have a copy of the slides, but essentially if your project falls within the scope of one of those items, then you could possibly qualify for the cost share. And then the most important part is the cost share approval process. So one thing that's important to keep in mind is we're not going to offer you the cost share. You have to actually request the cost share just because it may or may not be available. So when you're submitting your application to us for the activity, include in your letter that you would also like to apply for cost share if your project is able to be eligible for it. So as part of that would be under the pre-construction phase. And then after your project has been approved and you're getting your written approval, you would also receive a separate letter of approval for the cost share. And then during your construction phase, you want to remember to retain your receipts for the labor and materials. This is really important. If you're, it does have to be itemized receipts that say exactly what it is for, in order to make sure that you are able to get the cost share money. And I would go ahead and separate out the eligible portions versus the other portions of your project. For example, if you're applying to do a living shoreline and then also at the same time you're applying within the same application for a dock, of course the portion of the dock, you know, any of the materials related to the dock would not be eligible for the cost share. So just remember to keep those two separate. And then the next important item is you want to make sure that you fill out that post-construction report and return it to our section because that actually triggers us to go out and complete that post-compliance inspection that the project was constructed. And then after that, it triggers the Sussex Conservation District to contact you and to let you know. And actually, the Sussex Conservation District will contact you for that itemized receipt, and then they would disperse payment to you. So just in conclusion, I know it can be a little bit confusing at times to know what type of permit is appropriate for your project. So feel free to contact our office. We have a scientist of the day assigned to answer the phones and help out with any questions, and we're always open to pre-application meetings, and then we also have the joint permit processing process where you can actually come to our office and explain the project in front of a few others within that you would need your permit from, such as the representatives from the Corps. You'll have representatives from Generic Fish and Wildlife, Coastal Zone Management. So it's a good opportunity to take when you're proposing your project and designing it to see what permits would be needed from all the groups involved.
All right, yes. Thank you, Brittany. And thank you, Mike and Julie. Those were great presentations. I think permitting is, like Julie mentioned, always a big thing when going for any kind of project proposal, and no matter how much experience you have in the permitting world, things are changing. Nationwide permits get updated. SAA is being updated, so those are great presentations on permitting on the state and the federal level. So we wanted to take it one step further and focus a little more on an opportunity for permittees to get a pre-application project review. And Julie mentioned a little bit the joint permitting process, or JPP, opportunity, and so we wanted to take a little time here to kind of give a real-world situation and give you a little more information about JPP. So I'm going to share. So my presentation today has two components. One of them is to introduce you and give you more information about the JPP meeting. The other is to actually do sort of a mock JPP presentation where I will be going through a project that we really are proposing and to a small audience of JPP panelists that really are on it and seeking their input. And so, yes, I put this together for this project, for this workshop, but I really am going through the motions. And I've gone to JPP a couple of times to present projects that we have coming up, and it's been very useful. So we really wanted to share the information with you. So we have two components here. So just to get started, and I'm going to ask the panelists that I have on today to introduce themselves in just a minute. But to get started, what is a JPP meeting? So this is a monthly meeting that's hosted by DNREC, hosted by the Wetland Subaqueous Land Section, and it is an opportunity for a pre-application project review. So you've got some of your components put together, but you haven't submitted your application and paid your fees yet. It brings all of the reviewers, the proposal reviewers, into one room at one time. You are on the spotlight. You get to present your information. It's free. And you're going to solicit feedback. You're going to ask questions you have about your project, about your proposal. They're going to be able to raise any red flags, ask any questions, and even give you ideas, helpful ideas of how you can navigate through state and federal permitting. It's very helpful. The timing for how this works, you need to call the DNREC Wetland Subaqueous Land Section. I call, when I need to be put on the schedule, I call a month in advance. And they're held every third Thursday of the month. A week in advance of your scheduled time, you need to send in your materials. So via email, you send the materials to the Wetland Section, and they would submit or spread them out, distribute them to the panelists so that they can look over the material and have a good time, enough time to look over and know some of the questions and do a little bit of homework before they've actually come and meet with you. I do want to know from Julie how this is being handled now that we've gone virtual, so I'll ask her for that information. Who are the players of a JPP meeting? Lots of people here. So we have DNREC, Wetland Subaqueous Lands, of course, they're hosting this. We also have Division of Fish and Wildlife. It's going to be an environmental review coordinator. We'll have DNREC coastal programs in there looking, asking if, we need to have water quality certification or coastal zone consistency approval. DNREC's Division of Watershed Stewardship, NOAA, EPA, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So while we're here, I wanted to ask the different panelists to introduce themselves. So for today, we did not bring NOAA or EPA into this mix. So we do have representatives from the Wetland Section, obviously, Fish and Wildlife, coastal programs, and Army Corps. So I wanted to take a moment to ask each of them to introduce themselves and give their affiliation. And then also, in terms of JPP meeting, what are you looking for out of a project proposal for your section, for your program? So if you're with coastal programs, what are you looking for in a proposal specifically in terms of review? So I think our presenters, so Julie and Mike already have, and Christy already have presenter options to be able to unmute themselves, but Brittany's going to give Brian. So let's call on Julie first. Julie Molina with the Wetland Subaqueous Land Section. I know you introduced yourself already, so maybe when you're at the JPP, what are you looking for specifically?
I don't see her on right now.
Okay, maybe Julie has stepped away. So we'll move back. Just an extended break. All right, so let's move on and we'll come back to Julie.
Can you hear me?
Oh, there she is.
No?
There she is.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay. So I was just saying that it's typical when we have these JPP meetings that everyone will introduce themselves, and then from there the applicant would go ahead and present the project. So we do we do want a pretty good presentation given to us so that we know the scope of the project. We're looking for different elements, such as if you have an idea of what your proposal is, as far as, you know, having it something, even if it's not an engineer grade plan, if it's at least a conceptual plan, if you can put that on a plan view and cross-section view, that's something nice to supply to this meeting, and it would be part of your packet that you're supplying before you attend the meeting. You know, different things that is nice to also have is your anticipated schedule for your project completion, because, you know, as I was explaining during the presentation, that plays into the type of permit that you would need. You know, if it's something that you could complete within a 1-year construction window, then it would be, you know, the SAA. But if you need that longer period of time to construct it, then it would need to have to go through an alternative permitting process. So those are just two of the items, just thinking off the top of my head. But any information that you can give us on the background of the site, if you have, you know, something that I know that we routinely do, just because every site is different and every site is complex, we typically will do a review prior to the JPP meeting of the permitting history. So if you include in your packet of information to us, you know, those permit numbers, that's helpful. It's not necessarily needed, but it's something that we would go ahead and dive into and look into anyway, just so that we understand the full scope of what's going on that site before you come to you know, give us your presentation.
Okay, that's great. And Julie, can I ask how JPPs are being scheduled now that they are not in person?
So it is still the same process. You would call and go ahead and forward any information that you have when we would schedule it. Now, we are still having them every third Thursday. We're just doing it via Skype. So that's the main difference.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, we'll move down the list here to Division of Fish and Wildlife. We have Brian Galvez, an Environmental Review Coordinator. Brian, are you with us?
I am. Can you hear me?
Hi, good morning. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Brian Galvez. I'm currently the Environmental Review Coordinator for Delaware Fish and Wildlife, and so my job is to look at the project from a perspective looking at state endangered and rare, threatened, and endangered species, as well as federally threatened and endangered species. So I'll look at the project and the area and look at our database, which has those records of those types of species, and also reach out to the biologists, the species biologists who might be concerned with this project. Most of these projects are within a waterway, so a lot of times I'll be reaching out to the fisheries biologists, and we're also concerned with, you know, important commercial and recreational fisheries resources. So I review the project in terms, you know, with regards to those species and the impacts of those species. And then I will, usually we make a determination whether or not the project will have to have a time of year restriction with regards to those important species. So we'll go, well, I think we'll probably cover that more.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, let's move down. We have Delaware, we have the Delaware Coastal Programs. We have Christy Liskey.
Hi, Allison, can you hear me?
Hi, Christy.
Hi. So my name is Christy Liskey, and I am an environmental scientist at DENREC Delaware Coastal Programs. Our main goal at the meeting is to inform the presenter if a federal consistency review is required for their project, and to listen for potential impacts to Delaware's coastal uses and resources. So these can include impacts anywhere from air quality, historical and cultural resources, navigation, and a lot more, along with the resources that are managed and regulated by the other programs that are attending the meeting. as a networked program, we rely heavily on the concerns raised by the subject matter experts in the room to consider the magnitude of effects to coastal uses and resources. However, I want to explain that federal consistency and DCMP's authority to review the proposed projects is dependent on whether there's a federal action taking place, and it includes federal authorizations, which is typically one of the core permits that Mike was talking about earlier. As he mentioned, a lot of the Living Shorelines projects can be accomplished with a nationwide permit that DCMP has already issued blanket concurrence for. So in that case, the project will not be required to submit an application for federal consistency. However, if it's in a critical resource water, or if it ends up being needing an individual permit, Section 10 or Section 404, then we will end up reviewing that project. And we'd like to provide information on how they can submit their application form for federal consistency and what would be required during the meeting.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And then last but not least, from U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, again, we have Mike Yost.
Yeah, typically what the first major thing that we're looking for is a delineation of the project site, so showing the extent of the navigable waters and the waters of the U.S. Obviously, we want to see some sort of evidence of erosion, whether it's survey information or just historical aerial photographs that show the extent of the erosion, because if you don't have erosion, then you don't have a project. The time of year is important. When will the construction begin and end? Those are all important as far as potential EFH impacts, or if there are ESA impacts. Your methods of construction, whether or not there's going to be vessels needed to complete the activity, or if it's mostly hand labor or equipment from the shoreline, staging areas, and obviously input from the other agencies is important for resource concerns.
Okay.
You know, that's a lot of detail, and you don't have to necessarily cover all of that in a JP meeting. If you just have some sort of conceptual idea of what you want to do, that's perfectly fine too. But we are going to give you some sort of recommendations to make sure that when you submit an application, that it is as complete as possible.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. All right. So those are the panelists on the mini panel we have today, and I thank them all for joining and helping me out with this session. So moving on, and we'll hear more from them in a few minutes. So what to bring with you? As Mike detailed, you know, anything can be draft form, what you have at that time. The more, the better, because then you can present the most information to the panel and get the most feedback. So obviously you want a description of your project, any kind of baseline data that you have. You need to present some evidence that there is a problem that needs to be solved, some sort of shoreline issue that your project is going to resolve. If you have draft designs, I try to bring them. I try to also present some photographs of the site, what it looks like, so that the panel can get an idea of what's going on. Mention any partner information, as well as funding. How much do you think this is all going to cost, and where are you getting money from? And then lastly, if you've done any research, or if you have any related communications, maybe with the landowner or with the other partners, about how this is going to work and what you're going to do and how it's going to be successful. Excuse me. A few tips that I gathered from the panelists based on past presentations is do your homework. So make sure that you send that information in advance so that the panelists have a week to look at it before. So if there's going to be a time of year restriction, Fish and Wildlife, Brian's going to need a little time to check that out. So make sure you do your homework and be prepared. So bring either a PowerPoint presentation, I usually do that. I usually print out some copies to hand out as well. Every project that's on the schedule is allotted 45 minutes. So you need to be prepared to have time to present and to have time for discussion and questions afterwards, because when it's done, it's done. And there may be other presentations that are coming right before or right after you, and your time is limited. Also, you want to make sure that you take notes or you bring someone with you that can take notes. There are no minutes recorded for the JPP meeting. Included in your presentation, make sure to have an anticipated timeline, understanding that this is draft form. This isn't final for your proposal yet, but this can raise some issues with time of year or other considerations that the panel can bring up to you that you can iron out in advance before you get too far down the road. Have an idea of what you plan on doing for your state and federal permitting so that they can raise any issues. If you plan on going for this nationwide permit, Mike can say, well, it's too long, it's not the right building materials to apply for this nationwide permit. They can bring that up before you go through all the paperwork and get all the way down to permitting. And include, if there's other application processes that are related to the project, Julie mentioned this would be important to let them know, because they could actually bring in those other groups so that you can even have a bigger combined JPP review. And it's important for them to know what else is going on related to this project, other permitting application considerations. So you're going to, what kind of feedback can you expect? You're getting all this together and you're going in and you're meeting with them. What can you get out of it? There's a lot you can gain from presenting this pre-application. So they're going to be giving you guidance on appropriate permitting. If they can help you understand if there's a jurisdictional determination will be required before you submit an application, that may need to be part of your application. If there's more survey work that needs to be done and included in the application, if they expect that there's going to be some monitoring or mitigation required, giving you a heads up. Also be able to tell you if they expect there to be a time of year restriction. That's very important for how you design your timeline for your project. You want to know in advance, so they can help you out with that. And then also be able to tell you if a public notice is going to be needed or not, because that can play into your timeline of your project as well. So I wanted to stop here before I move into sort of my proposal to the panel and take any questions about the JPP meeting in general. I don't know if Brittany, if you've gotten any in the chat box.
I do not see any, so I think you're good to keep going.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and propose my project for my 4 panelists. And this is material that I genuinely would bring to JPP if I were going to be presenting this proposal. And so I'm going to go through the information that I put together, and then I'm going to seek their feedback and their questions afterwards. If you joined us yesterday and you were paying attention, you're already familiar with this project. So this is the Lewis-Rehoboth Canal project. This is one that I discussed yesterday in my designing for a project goal, and that Jesse also mentioned during his site eval. So we are in Lewis. We are on the Lewis-Rehoboth Canal. This is adjacent to our previous project that we put in 2014. This was our control site. And while we have watched this, our previous project, Living Shoreline, be successful, we have watched this control site crumble and continue to erode away. And so we identified this project genuinely out of need. So there's an overview of the canal, where our previous Living Shoreline is, and right next to it, this proposed area. It is about 115 linear feet. Looking at navigational challenges, we do understand where the channel lies. We don't anticipate in our design impeding into that buffer, so we're staying well out of the way of the navigational channel. In terms of ownership, this parcel is owned by the Lewis Historical Society. We do have somewhat of a relationship with them from our previous project that was on the owner next door. So we have worked with them and hope to work with them again on extending this project to secure this shoreline as it continues to erode away. We have a wetlands map. This is just using the NWI Wetland Mapper online. We have, this maps some estuarine unconsolidated bottom shoreline. At low tide, there is sort of like a mudflat area, and then above that is this palustrin scrub shrub, which is tidal as well now. It is mostly Iva and Phragmites. and then it goes right into upland. So there is a bit of a slope here, but it goes right into these. You can see the ball fields on the aerial photo. In terms of our problem, I mentioned we've been seeing a lot of erosion here. So we have several years of data on this site simply because we've been using it as our control for our previous project. So we're noticing a lot of erosion, clumps of Spartina falling off and floating away. Our monitoring plots have disappeared in several cases. So we're seeing about 1/2 of a foot of erosion horizontally per year from 2014 to 2018. So a lot of cusping, erosion. There are some areas that are starting to recolonize themselves, but overall we're definitely seeing a lot of erosion. And this map of some of our, that summarizes our survey work of the shoreline. So the green is our treatment from 2014, and then the yellow and the red are indicating where we have lost. We have gone negative since 2014 with the edge of the shoreline. So the very edge of the marsh platform has been eroding back. And we've lost about 49 square meters in this 4-year time span. So we are continuing to monitor there and seeing it continue. So we want to stem that and build the marsh platform back. Some of the features I wanted to mention that are there that we're aware of that we want to take into account in our proposal is an abundance of oysters, lots of oysters right along the shoreline and also out into the water, and lots of ribbed mussels up in the alternate flora on the existing wetland platform. And we do know from experience and just from visiting that there's a lot of suspended sediments in the water column there. Based on past experience, we anticipate that our project will be fed by natural suspended sediments and we won't need to bring in any fill, which is great. I prefer using natural fill if it will come in over time. We have mocked up a design for our project. This is the overhead view. So the edge of this is going to be constructed with oyster shell bags, a little more resilient to the wave action that we know is on this canal due to boats, especially in the summertime, and will help encourage colonization by the nearby oysters that we know are there. We have this winding shoreline edge, going to work around the oyster beds that are already there. You can see to the left, we're going to tie right in with that existing living shoreline project, and to the right, we're going to tie in nicely on the coast, the shoreline, to the next area, which is riprap. There's a little bit of rubble and some concrete and kind of an upland area, the wetlands end. So we want to build out our shoreline edge to where it previously existed, so we're not going below mean low water. We're going to need to raise significantly the elevation of the platform, so we're going to do this in a tiered manner. So we'll install this first line of shell bags, allow sediment to fill in for probably 6 months, and then come back and add a second inner layer of our line of oyster shell bags. And then we wanted to encourage more sedimentation by adding these inner cells, by adding core logs that are perpendicular. So we will add some coconut fiber core logs. I think we'd like to have, we've used matting on the bottom in the past, and our project adjacent to this where the bottom was a little softer. Over here it is a little sandier, but I think we'll probably still use some matting underneath. So these are all the construction components listed on here, the matting, the core logs, and the oyster shell bags. From a profile view, we do have, like I mentioned, a lot of survey work, so we know where the edge of the shoreline is now. We know where mean low water and mean low high is. So we're going to be bringing our project up to optimal growth range for Spartina alternate flora. We did add a couple of inches to that to account for sea level rise in the future. We want to let this build up over time. We do anticipate a lot of colonization naturally by oysters. We're not bringing in anything live, just nice cured oyster shells. So we are taking into account where mean low water is, mean high water, working within that range, not creating any habitat that's optimal for Phragmites to invade. And looking at our timeline, so we've been doing baseline monitoring actually for a couple of years. We have our draft design right now, and technically this is our JPP meeting right now. So based on the feedback I get from this, we'll finalize our design. We'll move into getting some permit applications together later this, probably early winter, late fall, and then as that comes in, we would start to order our supplies. Next spring, so we're targeting April as the best time to install. We would install that first outer edge of oyster shell bags. And then over the next months into the spring and the summer even, just monitoring the accretion and the stability of that first installation. Based on experience, we think that when we get to about October, we can install that second tier and the inner core logs. And then following that, we would just continue to monitor accretion, look at the elevation, integrity of the site, hoping that by the time we reach next spring, that in 2022, would be able to plant the new marsh if it's not already being colonized with Spartina plugs, and then continue to monitor and adaptively manage for the next 2 years after that. In terms of our budget and our partners, so we're working with the Delaware Partnership for the Delaware Estuary. They are providing some staff time and their expertise, and then all of the oyster shell bags. So that's a big contribution from them. And then from DNREC, we're providing staff time, some RTK survey work, and match. And then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is providing about $25,000 in funding for the supplies and some staff time, also providing some expertise. In terms of permitting, we were thinking of applying for a DNREC SAA. We are meeting, the criteria, I think, of preserving and improving ecosystem services. We're building back a wetland area that has eroded, trying to improve resiliency and function. We'd like to go for a conventional living shoreline based on the components that we're using, just core logs, oyster shell bags, plants, and the matting. I do think we might need to contact the shellfish program with the specific location of our project and the materials that we're using, since we are using oyster shells. We don't anticipate working below mean low water, so not triggering any lease fees. And I think we have already proven that erosion is evident. On the federal side, we were looking at going for a nationwide permit 54 for living shorelines. Our project is well below the 500 feet limit. We're not going anywhere near 30 feet below mean low water. We don't have any endangered species on our site, and we are planning on working around the sensitive bivalves that are there. In terms of monitoring into the future, we are definitely going to be looking at accretion of sediment over time. We'd like to try something that we've found, which is sediment plates instead of using feldspar plots. Hopefully it has more longevity. We've found that the feldspar plots sort of disappear after a handful of years. So monitoring accretion, of course, checking on the stability, the integrity of the site. Are things holding up? Do we have any winter ice damage? Any oyster shell bags roll away? Anything like that? Any of the core logs need work? And then monitoring the vegetation. So how much area is covered? What's the height? How thick and robust? What do we have growing? And then obviously the elevation of the site and the extent of the wetland platform as it builds up via RTK. That's the information I have for this project so far, and I welcome your feedback and questions.
All right, I can start.
Okay, great, Mike.
I guess we can start off with the time of year restriction as it relates to the regional conditions. Okay. Obviously, it's March 1 to June 30th in water work is the time of year restriction, but if you are working at low tide, technically there wouldn't be in water work, so it wouldn't be an issue, but just think about that and including that in your application if that's the case. Otherwise, if you do plan on working within that time of year restriction in the water, then we'd have to do some sort of coordination with National Marine Fisheries Service, probably some sort of expedited consultation, informal consultation for EFH. Okay. The other thing is as it relates to the federal navigation channel. We have the non-regulatory Section 408 review. but we would probably do some sort of in-house coordination because it looks like you are not working in a core property, and you're well outside of the federal navigation channel and the buffer. So most likely there would be no need for a full-blown 408 review, which would require a public notice and a bunch of additional time. So, like I said, we would just probably do an informal in-house review with the 408 coordinator for the Corps to make sure that the project would have no impacts to the federal navigation channel.
Great.
Other than that, the project looks pretty good. I would want to see the actual linear feet of shoreline protection. I know you said you're less than 500 feet, but we just want to see the actual number because obviously we do have that threshold, but the threshold can be waived if determined to still have minimal impacts. So just some things to consider.
And you'd like that linear footage to be put on the design map?
Yeah, or just in the project description or cover letter or what have you.
Okay. And I know the one thing I don't have, I have the linear length, the 115 feet, but I did not calculate the area based on the extent that we're proposing. So that is one thing I needed to add was the area of wetlands that I plan on creating.
Yeah, the area of impact as it relates to the core logs, what's the square footage or acreage, and the waters of the U.S., type of waters of the U.S. that will be impacting. Obviously, it would be probably the intertidal area, and it wouldn't necessarily be a loss. It would be more of like a conversion from a mudflat to a tidal emergent wetland.
Okay.
And Allison, we have a question from a participant about will there be a turbidity control with this project?
I was not planning on any sort of turbidity control. I don't expect there to be any issues since it will be trapping sediment out of the water column as it goes with every tide cycle. I don't expect there to be an issue of sediments going out into the river. If anything, we're pulling sediments out of the river.
This is Julie talking. Can you hear me now?
Hi, Julie.
Okay. I was just going to say sometimes we do require a turbidity curtain, but in this case, you're not requesting to place any fill there. You're just trying to trap sediment, so we wouldn't require it from our end either.
Okay.
But I just wanted to speak to the state's regulatory program. I was looking at the parcel data, and you mentioned it as well, that the U.S. Historical Society, they actually own the adjacent waterfront property. So have you reached out to them for some sort of agreement in order to conduct this activity?
I have not, since this is, in normal circumstance, I would have by now, but since this is sort of a mock, I have not actually reached out to them, but I would have normally.
Okay, so just before you actually submit the application, that agreement would have to be included in the application packet that you have permission from the landowner to conduct the activity and access and all that type of information.
Right.
And then the other question that I had, if you can go back to your plan view of the process on the slides. Was that a conceptual plan, or is that the plan that you were intending on submitting for the application?
I would probably put a little more on there, but overall, yes.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest you definitely want to include the linear footage, just like Mike said, and then also definitely include on the plans the mean high and especially the mean low water line, you know, clearly showing that you're not, even though it's on the cross section, we need it on the plan view too. So that needs to be also placed on the plan view, and then just looking at the property lines too. I know you said you were going to tie into the previous project that was authorized. If you could have an expanded project plan view that shows where the property lines are, to making sure you're not encroaching on any other property in the vicinity, because it looks like you are crossing for 115 feet when I just measured. It looks like you're going to be crossing 2 of the Lewis Historical Society's properties, but just, you know, keeping that in mind is the property lines. You can include that on the project plan. And then,
sure.
Yeah, just a little bit more detail. And then you know, you do have those rib muscles on the plans, but from what it sounds like in your you know, proposal, you're just expecting recruitment, right? You're not expecting to place. Okay.
No.
So I would just
no.
Then I would go ahead and remove them from the plans. Then you're just expecting recruitment. And then the other thing I want to point out, just because I'm actually processing a project on the adjacent shoreline, and I know you're going to be thinking about boat weights, but if you go back to one of your other aerials where it shows the scope of the project and the opposite shoreline, I just wanted to point out, not that one, the other farther extent view, zoomed out. Yes.
You went all the way out?
That one doesn't. I don't know if you had another one or if it was shown yesterday, but basically that marina, yeah, that's good actually. The marina on the opposite shoreline is expanding, where you see the mark to the left-hand side. They're actually installing an over 800-foot long floating dock, which is going to house 25 additional vessels. So it's just something to keep in mind when you're designing your projects, this particular project, that you know, I would just plan for additional boat wake, because this marina is for commercial vessels.
Wow. Okay, that's great to know. Christy or Brian?
Yeah, this is Brian. So this, like Mike said, most of this work's going to be done during low tide, and there's really not going to be any in-water work. So that's really what I'd be looking at. So we don't really have any fisheries concerns here, and I don't have any records of any rare, threatened, or endangered bird species in the marsh. We do have records of a state endangered four-spine stickleback. So if we would recommend, if there was any in-water work and there was known submerged aquatic vegetation around the site, that we would ask for a spawning window, a time-of-year restriction from April 1st to May 30th. But it doesn't look like that's going to happen, so we would trust you guys to, you know, make that determination yourselves. But if you guys are staying in the high tide, or the no in-water work's happening, all the work's going to be done during low tide on the mud flat, we don't have any concerns with this particular project.
All right, thank you.
Hi, Allison. Can you hear me? It's Christy from GTMP.
Hi, Christy.
Hi.
Yep.
So I just wanted to note that because you will be using the Nationwide Permit 54, the GTMP has already concurred with that, so a federal consistency certification will not be required. However, I did see that you will be using U.S. Fish and Wildlife funds. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So as I was saying earlier, federal consistency is dependent on federal actions, and that also includes federal funding. So we have a requirement to provide for federal consistency review for federal financial assistance to state or local governments. So when you do get that money, or when you're applying for that money, that you will need to also apply for federal consistency, federal financial assistance review.
Okay.
That is only a 30-day review, and it doesn't require public notice, so it's fairly quick process. We usually get them done even faster than 30 days. But just so you know, we will need to review that for federal consistency if you use the federal funding.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much.
And if you have any,
this is very helpful information from everyone.
I just wanted to add too that that you were correct in saying that the project did qualify for the Living Shoreline SAA. So
okay,
there's no other authorization that would be needed as far as water quality certification or anything like that.
Great. Thank you. All right. Well, I think we are definitely through our time, and I appreciate all of the panelists going along and helping me show the utility of the JPP meeting. It really is a nice, really useful tool, and I hope that participants here get a better idea of what's involved and will take advantage of this in the future. So with that, I will end.
Thank you, Allison. Excuse me. So yeah, I hope you all that are attending see that not only are living shorelines themselves, they involve many different pieces and parts, also permitting does. And that's why it's great to know who to talk to and who you can ask questions, because you can't know everything. It's hard to. So with that, we're going to switch from our permitting section to kind of quickly wrap up here, since I know we're going past our agenda, but we're still in our 9 to noon window, so I'm going to take what I can. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat box like normal. While I get my presentation set up here. And we're gonna wrap this thing up. So, as mentioned, we've covered a lot of different topics, and what I want to cover here are some of the aspects that we have run into, whether talking to people or just what we have experienced from designing living shorelines from our group here. So, overcoming common barriers. One of the first things you ultimately get asked by someone when they're interested in a living shoreline is, how much does it cost? But the issue comes up is there's no cookie cutter answer to that. As you have hopefully seen, there is so many different options when it comes to living shorelines, and they're all based on the individual site and the goals for that site. So you can't come up with X amount of linear feet of shoreline is going to cost X amount. It's just not possible. But we do have some examples here from our past projects to show you. The one here is the Lewis Ball Field. So this was the site that was actually installed, not the site we were just talking about. So this was done back in 2014, and the materials from that project cost a little over $4,000. I do know those rates have increased some since then, but it gives you a general idea that about it was $50 per linear foot for that project. I also have some numbers from the Sassafras project. So if you compare the materials of the last project to the materials of this project, you will see that the Sassafras is a hybrid project which had more rock and more hard components. That was about $80 a foot. So there's a big range in what they cost. We also have some other estimates here for the various aspects. This project was managed by the Delaware Center for Inland Bays and is a grant-funded project, and that's how we have those funds. However, we aren't able to give you the complete picture because a lot of the work we do is in kind. So, for example, for the Sassafras, our program did a lot of the survey work, and then we were able to use Denrac Fish and Wildlife staff for construction and equipment of the actual project, as Chris mentioned. So there are many different aspects involved when it comes to figuring out how much they cost, and it's quite difficult to come up with an answer. I have been told many a time or asked that are living shorelines cheaper than a hardened structure? And personally, I think it depends. They can be, but they can also not, because you're not taking into account monitoring or any maintenance that needs to happen in the future. Right now, there's just so many undetermined variables that coming up with that, how much does it cost right out the bat, is really not possible. But on the flip side, when you look at living shorelines, you are adding a benefit to the shoreline. So there's economic value you're adding back into the site, where you are providing more habitat for those fisheries. So in turn, you are impacting the fisheries or tourism economy aspect of it. So there's a non-tangible dollar value you are adding back into the site that may not have been there before. So trying to get people to understand what they're shelling out versus what they return is all part of the project of promoting living shorelines. Which leads me to my next point is there is a lot of misunderstanding when it comes to living shorelines, from what they actually are to their benefits. And I actually recently just saw something on social media yesterday where there was an organization that posted a picture of a living shoreline with a sill, and there's a bunch of questions going on beneath this picture of how is this a living shoreline? It has a rock component, I don't understand. And there was a good dialogue going back and forth about the different types of living shorelines. So there still is a lot of uncertainty in what a living shoreline means. Even further, there are benefits of why choose living shorelines. So all those benefits we talked about before, those are great selling points that I think a lot of the public and even practitioners don't generally understand. This picture here is one we use quite often in presentations, but it is really good at showing how a shoreline, a tidal marsh, can reduce that wave energy. So that red line is the edge of a tidal marsh, and it's completely flooded, but you can see the wave energy has died back. There's also the trying to get people to choose something they aren't familiar with can be hard, which I'm calling here the neighbor effect. So if everyone has a bulkhead, you're most likely to get a bulkhead because that's what you see. So trying to overcome that barrier of just because they have a bulkhead doesn't mean you necessarily have to have one. But it does make it a little bit more difficult, or can. And then there's the adaptive management term, which if you're the public, personally, I don't think adaptive management should be used as a selling point because it sounds scary, and what does it really mean? So that's kind of from a public promotional, trying to promote living shorelines, maybe that is not a term that should be used, but it is a great tool when you are designing and building living shorelines. As Bart mentioned earlier, the plan you have and your heart set on may not be what the as-built is intended. So you may have to manipulate things on the fly, change your planting patterns, change your drainage issues. So expect the unexpected is one of the biggest takeaways really with any project that you're planning. If you are set for all outcomes, you can effectively make your end result better for everyone. And then also adaptive management goes into the monitoring phrase, but that is one of the hard selling points for people trying to take on this tactic and people interested in having it installed on their property. For two reasons, it makes it sound scary, but monitoring is really just a fancy word for keeping an eye on things. And tell me one landowner that isn't keeping an eye on their property anyways. If they're asking for some sort of shoreline modification, then they've been keeping an eye on their property. And as Josh mentioned, there are so many different ways you can do this that span from easy to simple. I mean, you can do it just simply sticking a spot in the ground and going there every so often and taking a photo and using those photos to catalog the change. Or you can get more expensive. It depends on what you want. But whether you are a landowner or a practitioner, monitoring should not be scary. It can be easily done even if you don't have a science background. And the best way to think of a living shoreline is it's a garden. If you like tending a garden, you will most likely like tending a living shoreline. A lot of the same concepts apply. Another thing that we have seen throughout the years is having a team in place helps tremendously with a more effective project. When we started this workshop here, our target audiences were marine contractors. And what we found was that they didn't have the time to take to learn this new method and then the time to go back and monitor it. And then they didn't want to put a product out there where they couldn't put a stamp on it and say this project is good for X amount of years. It's not that they weren't interested in it, but in trying to get them to take on this tactic, we were asking them to change their entire business plan. And that's not fair to them for multiple reasons, because we're asking them to take on an aspect that's not familiar of them. So over the years, we started changing our target audiences, and then we finally came to the realization that putting a team together can help you focus on what needs to get done and not miss the pieces and parts. And I think the Sassafras project that Chris talked about highlights that tremendously. A year out and the project looks phenomenal. So when you're trying to put together these projects, and try including your landscape architects, your engineers, your scientists, your marine contractors, not only will it help the project be more successful, it'll be more appealing to grantors, and you might even be able to make your resources go a little bit farther because one of them has access to volunteers that the other doesn't, or equipment that the other doesn't. Pulling a team together, again, helps tremendously. And then another thing that has been mentioned before, but I just wanted to highlight, is that living shorelines aren't bound by properties. Nature isn't bound by properties. That is something humans put on our land. That is not something that nature recognizes. So when you look to go for a living shoreline project, look at the entire area. See how that entire area is affected. Maybe it's not affected, or maybe it's something like you only have erosion happening in the property that you're on, but to the right, there is an entire stand of frag. So that frag, if you build up your living shoreline to a high marsh elevation, that frag might come over and cultivate, and then you just created an island of frag. So, but if you look at the surrounding area, you can then determine, hey, there's frag, I need to pay attention to that, and maybe change your design a little bit to kind of make it a little bit wetter so frag doesn't want to be there as likely. But not only that, larger projects are not necessarily more expensive. If you're there anyway, if you're buying materials anyway, adding on a little bit more and trying to get other landowners involved may lead to a more successful project. And then I hope what was very clear by this morning's presentations is you need to consider the regulations and permits and everything as you are designing your project. I have had so many projects come across my desk where they're like, hey, look at this, isn't this cool? And I look at it and see like this huge boardwalk going through the marsh, and I'm like, that is very cool, and it would be very educational, but it's not going to get through permitting. So always consider your local rules and regulations in the design of your projects. Don't look at them after the fact. You might end up heartbroken with an aspect that you really wanted in there that you can't have. It's just not allowed. And then finding materials. So there's some materials that are harder to find than others. Oyster shell can be one of them, more specifically local oyster shell. You want it local because you don't want to introduce bacteria or other organisms that aren't native to your habitat. In Delaware, there are 2 recycling shell programs. One is from the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary in northern Delaware, and then the Delaware Center for Inland Bays is in southern Delaware. And they both take shells from local restaurants. I believe PEE takes them from individuals too, and cure them and get them ready to be used in projects such as living shorelines. And then the other one that, depending on where you're located, could be hard to find is fill, the appropriate fill for the area. So you just need to do your research, figure out what works for your area, what is local. The more local you can get it, the better it is for the habitat around you. And then finally, my last word of of wisdom is funding. There are quite a few grants out there at the state and federal level that could be used for funding living shorelines, but I just wanted to make you all aware of one that is ongoing right now, or is trying to be. It's the Living Shorelines Act of 2019. As of 7/22, it has got sent to the Committee of Commerce, Science, and Transportation, and it is a bill that directs NOAA to provide funding to states for living shorelines. So if you wanted to keep an eye on that bill and figure out what it's doing, you can visit it online at that website there. With that, those are my quick and dirty tidbits of our lessons learned. Last, even more resources for you because you didn't have enough to begin with. Again, our DelawareLivingShorelines.org website. It's intended for the general public, and it provides information on what living shorelines are, how to begin the process of thinking about if your property is suited for a living shoreline. So it talks about erosion and troubleshooting and permitting. It also has a link for providers. So it has lists of people that provide materials, the different services. It's currently being updated, so it'll get a little bit more detailed in the future, but you can go there if you are looking for a provider, or you can go there if you are interested in becoming a provider in Delaware. It has a link where you can submit your information. And again, this website is where our additional trainings and even more resources are available. And one thing I wanted to bring up, because it got brought up in multiple presentations, is the VIMS Shoreline Inventory. Their inventory is available at this website that's highlighted in yellow, and the data is available for sections of Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and North Carolina. And this data describes the land use and then shows structures on it. So that's the data that has been talked about and will be useful when you begin to kind of look at the area and see what's hardened, what's not, and what's going on. And then, of course, I also wanted to mention that not only we provide resources to you all to learn more about living shorelines, we also provide resources for the general public to help promote them in general and clients, potential clients. There was a sheet that was included online for you all that has lists and links. And I also wanted to mention that there are, I think, 4 or 5 one-pagers that describe additional projects. So if you want some more project examples, you can go on that page and find those. And they have, the majority of them have the project, what the goal was, the cost for materials, so you can see more costs associated with it, and how they are doing years down the road. So that was my quick and dirty version of presentation. If you have any questions about anything, please feel free to send them in the chat, email any of the presenters. I just wanted to let you know. All right, Mike, you can go ahead and talk. That's all.
Yeah, just kind of a couple things to add as far as resources go. Use your regulators as a resource. They are ultimately going to be reviewing your application and your plans and hopefully approving your project. But the regulators see several enhancement type projects every year, and they see what works, and they see them go in the ground and pay attention to their functioning after their construction has been completed. So they know what works and what doesn't work. So if you're trying something new or something that you haven't done before, they may have seen that same exact thing already and can point you in the right direction. The other thing I would say is during your design phase, you want to make sure that your impacts are the minimum necessary to meet the project goals. So avoid over-engineering your project and keep the whatever permit authorization you're trying to get in mind as you're designing, so you're not having to adjust things based off of the terms and conditions, and avoiding back and forth between the regulatory agencies. And that's all I got.
Thanks, and those are great things. The over-engineering one is also one I've also come across quite often, is make it, because you add more structure, it'll be better, when that is not necessarily the case, and something to remember. Do any of the panelists have anything else they'd like to add?